like the black reason is all this construction, all this knowledge, all this comment that articulated to convert the black people as a non-human. This is critical. And this explains why today we get to the phenomenon in parentheses about Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter because all this process, after the 21st century, we're still having a discourse and practice about dehumanizing black. So critique de la raisonnerie give us instrument, epistemological instrument to understand this phenomenon. And this is a book like I recommend strongly. And Achille Mbembe can be put in parallel with the greatest, the master, Molefi Asante, and someone like a young like him, like Roland Rabaka, and his book African Critical Theory and the concept of Afrocentricity. About the Afrocentricity is also a little bit strange how between black scholars you have a fight about this concept. Because the training is based on the Eurocentric lens, people are reluctant to use Afrocentricity. But the Afrocentricity is not to put away other kind of knowledge. The Afrocentricity is co-occupy the space. Co means together, occupying together the space of knowledge. What I call the coloniality of knowledge and the coloniality of power, because the coloniality of power is consubstantial with the coloniality of knowledge. If you see also, I insist here to talk about the decolonial theory, and I take my distance from the decolonial theory simply because Walter Mignolo, who is from Argentina, and talk about the decolonial theory, he talk about a kind of face-to-face between the global south, that means all the people who have been colonized, and the global north, like the Eurocentric world. The problem with this kind of theory, recognizing first the big contribution of Walter Mignolo, the problem of that is like we are assuming on this perspective, like within Latin America you don't have a tension, but within Latin America you have a tension between the African descent in Latin America who want to articulate their own discourse and the European descent in Latin America who have a dominant discourse. So it needs to be clear. That's why I take a little bit my distance from decolonial theory, although it brings a lot of contribution in the field in terms of reappropriation of black, of the African subject discourse. I want to go to the next one, and I explained that already. I was talking at the beginning of deconstructing the concept of classics and rhetoric. I want to come here another concept to deconstruct and decolonize. It's about the dialectics they always talk about when they talk about rhetoric in the ancient Greeks. Is strange though, because in Africa you have something called lab apalab. Lab apalab, it was like the big tree, the baobab, under which the chief was having this kind of dialectic, the dialogue, what Socrates developed in the past. So this is not new. It's millenary rhetoric in Africa. So anytime you talk about the rhetoric in classics, you should refer also to the concept of lab apalab. Lab apalab, I don't know why they never translate it in another language, originally in French. But if you go, now you know you just type it, you go to Google, and you have everything. And for what this discourse serves, the colonial discourse, what they serve for? They serve for in the Americas, for instance, to still leaving the African subject on its place. We need to remember that. They serve always to leave African subject on its place, and in the case of a worldwide vision of construction of a discourse on the humanities is to make sure the overall African subject won't be out from being non-human. So this is very important to know and to articulate. In this context, I want to bring something that they don't talk often about, and it's part of the African subject. Don't forget, I say African subject is the African in Africa, the African descent in America, the African descent in Europe, or wherever they are. In the 1920s and 30s and later on 40s, in US, for instance, you have what we call the Harlem Renaissance. And nobody, when you go to look at the books, when you type history book of Google if you want, when you type Renaissance, you will see the trace through Europe. You won't see the reference to the Harlem Renaissance. But yet, if you put Harlem, then yet they will take you to the Harlem because it takes you to black. And not taking you to black to say it was great discourse though, just to show you how isolated it was as a movement. In the same time, my point here is like in the same time in France, there were a discourse also about black pride in France called négritude, about the claiming of a blackness, of the African subject identity, the pride in the United States, the pride in Europe, in France, and another pride in Latin America at the same time, negrismo. So the discourse about self has been always parallel to the discourse that has been constructed by the Eurocentric lens, but is never put there. At the same time also, in Brazil, for instance, you have a concept in Brazil and Mexico. We will see one example about something I want to show. In Brazil, there is a book that appeared also in the 30s, see, to like counter arrest all this black pride, that counter arrest, but also trying to sneak a little bit, because the author of this book, his name was Gilberto Freire. Gilberto Freire wrote a book, Casa Grande e Senzala. Casa Grande and Senzala is in Portuguese and is translated in French, Spanish, English, so don't worry about that part. This book is phenomenal. It's phenomenal for what he did historically. I'm not saying for black people. Because in this book, Gilberto Freire tried to demonstrate, like now in Brazil, from now on, you have a racial democracy. It's done. No more fight for black. We should not talk anymore about black. Of course, he was covering the practice of racism in Brazil, because they were racism, and they still have racism today. So, in front of him, you have another one, just a note, a footnote. Gilberto Freire was white Brazilian. In front of him, younger than him, you have Abdias do Nascimento. Abdias do Nascimento appeared in 1974 and wrote a critical and strong book that is called Miscegenation or Massacre. So you have all the program there. So, or in Brazil, you are accepting the theory, the thesis of Gilberto Freire, or you are simply programmed to disappear as a black. And this is literally also, not only symbolically. Today, in Salvador da Bahia, you have this phenomenon of genocide that has been denounced by a black leader in Salvador da Bahia. For your recall, Salvador da Bahia is the place in Brazil where you have the most black in Brazil. So Abdias do Nascimento tried to bring his discourse with the African subject in Brazil, saying, no, here we don't have a racial democracy. Here you have a novel discourse, you have a discourse of black need to be acknowledged in Brazil. And I want to play something about Mexico, the case of Mexico.
Plain sight.
They mix from the beginning. You cannot see them, but it's there.
Listen very well. This is Black in Latin America, by the one you know.
To solve the mystery of Mexico's missing black population.
This is my family. Well, I show some pictures to show you. And this is a very old picture, and this is my grandpa with his sons.
The banditos.
Yes. And this is the wedding of my parents.
Oh, look how pretty your mom is.
But he's a dark man, and him, right,
So your family is part black?
is part black. And it's something that was committed until I was 19 years old.
How did you find out that you were part black?
Because I traveled to Cuba. And when I arrived there, they started talking about the African heritage and the culture. I suddenly realized my family was black. Because it looked like my grandpa, looked like my father. And when I started tasting the food, I said, oh my God, it's the food my grandma prepares at home. I recommend you to taste the mogo mogo. Actually, yes, South African. And we have the same recipe in Puerto Rico, it's fufu.
In Ghana, fufu.
Right.
Fufu is like having a bowling ball in your
Right.
belly.
Yes, yes. And in Cuba it's called mofongo. And here we have fried yuca.
I love fried chicken. It's like a deep fry.
Right. This was originally prepared by slaves. They needed carbohydrates.
Yeah, they had to work all day in the sun.
Right.
This was some good food. How did it make you feel suddenly to discover?
Weird. Weird. It was like if you will be this, you will discover you're adopted.
When you came back and told your family, did they tell you you went loco up there, drinking too much rum?
I asked my grandpa, why you never told me we are black? And he called my hand and told me, sweetie, we are not black, we are morenos. Of course he was aware that he was a black man, but he rejected that identity.
That's interesting.
And I think this happens in most families, that you hide the black grandma in the closet.
Black grandma in the closet.
Yeah.
In America, traditionally, we had one drop.
Listen
black,
that part.
you were black. If the one drop rule were applied in Mexico, all of these people would be black.
Did you hear that? Who can repeat what he said at the end? Can you repeat, stand up and say that? Stand up.
Facing this way, sir? Or,
At the end, what he said.
in America, the one drop rule states that if you have one drop of black blood, then you're black. If all of these people, referring to the Mexicans, were to follow the one drop rule, all of them would be considered black.
Thank you. Thank you. So that, in context, I translated that way. That is very important from him, though. He's not trying to brag about the one drop rule in US. It's because since in US, the identity is institutionalized by the one drop rule, in Latin America, the identity is not institutionalized by anything. You claim your blackness individually. And people are scared to claim precisely this blackness because all we discuss about them, the inferior, the savage, the primate, etc., etc. And this, what Henry gets said, is very important on the history of Mexico. Because at one point in the 1920 in Mexico, Jose Vasconcelos, who was an educator, philosopher, statesman, said the following: we need to have in Latin America an identity based on mestizaje. Translated, mestizaje means miscegenation. And he goes even far. He went even far. He said, why? Not to acknowledge black. He decided to do the contrary. Because he said, I'm quoting him, he said, in chemistry, if you put the black and white, the black disappears. End of quote of Jose Vasconcelos. And you see this discourse of Henry Gate Jr. come to deconstruct that about no black in Mexico. Like Mexico is a place of either indigenous or a miscegenation. And this, what Henry Gate just said, show you how, in reality, each Mexican has the African descent. It's just because the claiming of identity is not based on the one drop rule. This point was critical to understand that. And then I have an example of Lucia Mbomio. I won't play the case of Lucia Mbomio. It's just about, for instance, we discussed about black in Europe. Now Europe is acknowledging black. And remember, like in Europe, black are not coming from the enslavement. Black are coming from the fight they did for France during the First and Second World War. And they come from migration. They come from also the refugee and asylum system. So they assume in the imaginary, in France for instance, like any black come from somewhere first, before the French citizen. But the question here is like, wherever you come from, while you become French citizen, you're simply French. Or this is a system that is in place in Europe. So Lucia Mbomio case caught a lot of my attention because she's living in Spain. Her dad was a diplomat from Equatorial Guinea, well educated. Her mom is a white Spanish lady, but yet when Lucia Mbomio goes somewhere, they ask her, later I can give that to you, we see the video. They ask her, where are you from? She said, I'm from Madrid. Madrid is the capital of Spain. They say, okay, yes, but where you from? She said, hey, I'm from Madrid, I'm Spaniard. They say, don't play that game with us. Where are you come from? So they're trying to say, you may be institutionally Spaniard, but in our imaginary, the colonial imaginary, the representation that we have about black and the representation of what we have about our place that is supposed to be Eurocentric and whitish place, we not belonging here. So the discourse and what Mbomio creates, he creates a movement called Afrofemina, is also what I was saying at the beginning of my presentation, the deconstruction, the African subject decolonization of the imaginary. And I want to finish by a succession, yes, 1 minute, a succession of image. A succession of image. I want you to see those images. Antonio Maceo is a part of those who fought for the Cuban freedom. He was a general of army. He fought with someone called Jose Marti. If you go on Google, this is the good time about 21st century on Google. You put Jose Marti, you will see, like they talk about Jose Marti like a Jesus Christ. He was a white Cuban fighter. When you get to Antonio Maceo, they present him as someone who was working under. He was a general. I don't know if you know the hierarchy in military. After the general, nobody else. But they say he was working under Jose Marti. And see the two pictures. The second picture is on the Museum of Art. And they're whitening him because they say he was so smart to be black. So that's why they're whitening him like that. The next is Bencos Bureau. He was a maroon in Colombia. And you need to know, like all the maroon, by definition, was the founder of the pre-civil rights fighter. Because they were not being freeing the people only. They were freeing all the country. And you ask me why they were freeing all the country. Because don't forget, like, in the colony in Latin America, you had the crown in Spain, the case of Spain or Portugal, you have a crown there, and then you have a white who were born in Latin America. Those were the one who was fighting with black for freedom. So the black, Benkos Bioko, being a maroon, was putting the path for the freedom, not only for black, but also for all countries. They don't talk often about them, but in terms of rhetoric, sometimes they show them to precisely invisibilize them. They show them, and nobody thinks they were fighting as a black civilization. And Gaspar Yanga, you remember they were saying mestizaje Mexico, and really they said no. Gaspar Yanga was also a maroon in Mexico, and this one was Zumbi dos Palmares in Brazil, and the last one is funny. When I saw the picture of Duty Bookman, if you notice, they show him as a witch, because they don't want to represent him as someone who was important. For instance, if I ask you, I know you have 1 minute, but if I ask you now, what do you think about the voodoo? I know all of you will jump. Voodoo? Ooh, I don't want to die. But voodoo is a religion, simply like Catholicism. It is. I mean, is it simply like that? Just it's from African. And Bookman was the one who with Cecile Fatima. See, white. This is another conversation. White black place on freedom in the Americas. Is with her. They were in the conspiration of Bois-Caïman, and with that, and I will conclude. They freed the first black nation in the world. Thank you.
Our last speaker for this roundtable, Professor Darrell Harris. Black politics, its meaning and purpose.
Good morning, everybody. Okay, so I want to talk to you all about black politics, what we call black politics. And so I will just sort of summarize some of the meaning and purpose of black politics. So a little bit of background. But before the background, I should indicate there are some challenges with the way the term, the phrase, and ultimately how we think of black politics. There's some challenges here. So I want to suggest two different ways of thinking about just the term itself, and then I'll go into some of the historical context and meaning. So one might think of black politics with an uppercase P, such as black politics, the uppercase P, and black politics with a lowercase p. Black politics with a lowercase p would be all black political thought and behavior, historical, contemporary, irrespective of quality, such that you might have black political thought and behavior that's radical or conservative, revolutionary. So we're not placing any value on the thought and behavior when we think of black politics with a lowercase p. So in a sense, this would be the data set that those who study black political thought and behavior would have access to. And then black politics with an uppercase P refers to what we call the field of study or discipline. So those who are black political scientists, their data, of course, would be black political thought and behavior. Of course, that would also entail studying the institutions and other groups that interact with black people. So some context then. Now, what about this field of study we're talking about? Black politics as a field of study has its origins in the 1960s. With the 1960s is this very important decade in American history. And one might think of it as black people in this country being in full revolt. Okay, so on the first third of the 1960s is dominated by the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King, young students, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, challenging this country on civil rights and voting rights. By the middle of the 1960s, you have the Black Power movement making its way, becoming more pronounced in expressing black political thought and behavior. It was in the latter part of the 1960s where you have black college students, primarily at white universities, who were fed up with the Europeanization of human consciousness. They were fed up with the curricula only dealing with the history of European peoples, whether it's in Europe or Europe's diaspora. So these are black college students, primarily on white college campuses, and they began to demand courses, instructors who would teach about the black experience. Okay? And the first Black Studies program, some of you know, you have courses here at Howard, you would know this is at San Francisco State University. So that doesn't mean there weren't people who studied black political thought and behavior before that period. Okay? So we don't want to make that argument. And there's some debate on these because, well, people say, well, you know, there were studies on black political thought and behavior before the 1960s. But that doesn't constitute a field of study or a discipline. So the development of black politics as a field of discipline has a distinct historical pedigree. The late 1960s, black college students demanding, using, by the way, informal types of political expression, building takeovers, taking over administration buildings, placing their demands on the table and saying, this is what we want. Okay? So that's the historical context with respect to black politics as a field of study. Now, one of the challenges with black politics as a field of study, black political scientists, most black political scientists, this is my complaint and my critique of my colleagues in the field who do black politics. They settle for only, so if you study black political thought and behavior, they refer to that as black politics. Well, I differ from that. For me, and this is my next point about the term black itself, the term black, most people who think of it only think of it in phenotypic terms, meaning skin color or sociological. If I walk out this building and you see me 2 blocks away, you'll say that's a black person. And so the scholars settle just on that, and they refer to that as black politics. I'm suggesting something different. For me, black is a metaphor for the historical and cultural experiences of black people. So black in this context, the phenotype aspect, and one might add genotype too, is a secondary consideration. If we think of black as a metaphor for the historical and cultural experiences of black people, and then we can identify those values, ideas, concepts that have evolved in black people's history. And so those values, ideas, and concepts become the stuff, the substance, that I would argue black scholars should use then to evaluate the lowercase p, black political thought and behavior. In other words, this becomes the philosophical stuff that black scholars then would use to evaluate a Clarence Thomas or Martin Luther King. So the critique would be based on the stuff that evolved out of black people's history and culture, instead of what dominates right now, what Dr. Akasi was making a point. Tragically, black intellectuals still orient themselves based on what white political scientists do, that is Europe. So you take the typical, you go to graduate school, you take your first course that deals with the philosophical dimensions of political science.